Hi everybody, welcome to our first online lecture. Online lectures are not necessarily ideal in the sense that it doesn't allow for the regular discussion that I usually enjoy during lectures. That being said, I'm going to do the best I can to raise questions that I know students have asked in the past. So hopefully that will help the process along. And obviously, if any questions go unanswered during the online lectures this semester, then you can always ask me those questions when we do see each other in class or outside of class if you want to set up a meeting together. We can obviously do that too. So again, the hope is that we can cover a lot of the foundational research concepts through these lectures. You will take quizzes on these lectures. And that way, during our class time, we can focus more on the applied nature of research because that does tend to be where students need and appreciate the most assistance. So for this first lecture, we are going to look at four main components. We're going to look at what empirical research is and why we do it. We're going to look at the different types of research. We're going to look at the steps in the research process. And then we're also going to look at how to conduct literature searches. So we will start with empirical research. What is it? What are the steps? And what is the purpose? So when we think of empirical research is quite simply just research that involves analyzing data for the purpose of gaining knowledge. So anytime you collect and analyze data for the purpose of gaining knowledge on a particular topic, that would be referred to as empirical research. Now, the data that you're gathering and analyzing can be quantitative, so it can be numbers, or it can be qualitative. So if you are asking people open-ended questions, for instance, in an interview or in focus groups, that would be qualitative data. And we can analyze that data to answer our research questions, or we can administer surveys that collect quantitative data, and we can analyze that for the purpose of answering our research questions. So anytime we're analyzing data, be it qualitative or quantitative, for the purpose of gaining knowledge, that's referred to as empirical research. I'd also like to add to that data that we collect can be primary or secondary. So primary data means that you have collected that data specifically for the purpose of your study. So let's say I'm interested in looking at contraception use among NKU students. If I go out and administer a survey related to contraception use and I collect and analyze that data, that is primary data because I collected it specifically for the purpose of my study. Secondary data means that it's data that was previously collected for another purpose outside of your research study, but you are now using it and analyzing it to answer your research question. So for instance, if we stick with that topic of contraceptive use, let's say the health department administers surveys to all of its incoming patients, and a few of the questions on that survey, on that assessment instrument that you use, pertains to contraceptive use. If I then go to the health department and say, can I use this data to look at my own research interests, and they give me permission to do so, that would be secondary data. The health department did not collect that data specifically for my study. However, I am using it to answer my research question. So again, that's the difference between primary and secondary data. Primary, again, means that you collected it specifically for your study. Secondary means that somebody collected it for other purposes, but you are using it to answer your research question. And again, just to reiterate, empirical research just is any research that involves the analysis of data to answer your research question, to gain knowledge. So why would we engage in empirical research? Why would we analyze data? Well, the reason why we analyze data is to answer a research question for which we don't know the answer. So if we have a question, a burning desire to answer a question because we feel that, for instance, it would benefit our client population, it would assist us in determining if our intervention is successful, etc. If we have a research question of that nature that we want to get answered, that's when we would engage in empirical research. Whenever you have a research question that has not been answered yet, that's referred to as a gap in the literature. So a gap in the literature is any time that you have found an area that has not been researched adequately. So an area that you feel requires further research. That is referred to as the gap in the literature. So anytime we conduct a research study, an empirical research study, the intent is always to fill those gaps in the literature. When we think about empirical research, it's also important for us to think about the relationship between theory and research. And that relationship can be either deductive or inductive. So a lot of times with social workers and in the social sciences in general, our research is really inductive in nature. So let me explain that a little bit more. If you're working at an agency that treats, let's say, eating disorders, and you are working specifically with individuals who struggle with anorexia, and in working with your clients, and let's say you've had 12 clients in the past month that are struggling with anorexia, and you've noticed that among those 12 clients, 9 of them have told you that they have a history of child sexual abuse. So you have these observations of your own clients that 9 of your 12 clients have this history of sexual abuse. If those are your observations, you may then start to wonder, is this actually a trend that you would see nationwide if you collected data, or in the larger community if you collected data? So based on your own observations, you may form a hypothesis that says that there is a relationship between, or that, for instance, child sexual abuse may be a risk factor for experiencing anorexia later in life. So you form your hypothesis based on your own observations. Then once you have formed that hypothesis, you will collect data, you will then analyze that data, and based on your findings, it will allow you to develop a theory on this issue. So with inductive research, really you're starting small. You're starting with just a few observations, and then hopefully the result would be that based on your research, you can then develop a theory, a broader theory on this topic. So that's inductive, and very commonly that's the relationship between research and theory in the social sciences. Deductive is the other way around. With deductive, you start with a broader theory. Based on that theory, you form a hypothesis. You then collect data and you analyze that data and figure out if your data either supports your theory or goes against that theory. So an example there would be when I conducted my dissertation research, I looked at whether insecure attachment patterns are a risk factor for experiencing partner violence victimization. So I really started with a theory. I started with attachment theory and looking at the characteristics of insecure attachment, and then I came up with my hypothesis that potentially these characteristics of insecure attachment could result potentially in victimization, a higher risk for victimization in adulthood. So again, I started with theory, then I honed that down into a hypothesis. I collected data to test that hypothesis, and then found that my data supported the theory. So again, there can be these two different relationships between theory and research. It can either be deductive, where you start with theory, you narrow it down to a hypothesis, that results in data collection, and then your findings will either support or go against the theory. Or it can be inductive, where you start with a few observations. Those observations lead you to form a hypothesis. You then collect data and analyze that data to either support your hypothesis or not, and that can then result in the development of a theory. So with inductive, you start small and you go broader. With deductive, you start broad and you work your way smaller. Okay, so that is the relationship between theory and research. The research process has 5 main steps. we, as a class, are going to go through all 5 of these steps over the course of the next 2 semesters. So this semester and next, we will go through all 5 of these steps and complete an empirical research study. Each of you will complete an empirical research study between now and May. The first step in the research process is to ask or pose a research question. So when you pose a research question, that question should be narrow and specific. You don't want it to be too broad. You should be able to answer your question with observable data. Your question should be meaningful to the social work profession. There should be more than one possible answer. So if you just say, let's say your research question is, are men and women both enrolled in the MSW program? Well, the answer to that is yes, we know that. So you want to make sure that whatever question you answer hasn't been answered yet, and that there are more than one possible answers. And also your research question should be feasible. So it needs to be something that you can actually answer with data that you're collecting for the class. Once you have formulated a research question, then you will start to review the literature on that topic. So that's the next step, step 2, reviewing the literature on your topic. You would read peer-reviewed articles to find out what we already know about your research question. Has that question already been answered or not? If the question has already been answered in the literature, then you can refine that question so that it's more specific, and then you would explore that more specific area of your topic. So for instance, it might be that there's already literature on the impact of campus climate on college students, but research may not have already examined the impact of campus climate on first-generation college students. So see how we went more specific from looking at college students in general to now looking specifically at first-generation college students. Similarly, if you had an interest in food insecurity and your question was, what is the impact of food insecurity on academic outcomes of NKU students? If we already knew the answer to that question, you could narrow it down and say, what is the impact of food insecurity on the academic outcomes of first-generation college students, or another specific population you're interested in? So again, you review the literature, you figure out what do we already know about this research question that I have in mind. If that question has already been answered, then you will narrow that question down, make that question even more specific so that you are focusing on a topic that hasn't been explored yet. Then step 3 of the research process, that's where you're going to refine your research question, or you could transform your research question into a hypothesis. So a research question, for instance, if we stick with this question of what is the impact of food insecurity on the academic outcomes of NKU students, that's your research question. If you review the literature and you see that really the literature suggests that food insecurity has a negative impact on academic outcomes, then you could transform your research question into a statement. So your statement could be, food insecurity has a negative impact on the academic outcomes of NKU students. So you turn your research question into a research statement. You go from saying, what is the impact, to saying, it has a negative impact on academic outcomes. A null hypothesis is a specific type of hypothesis, and we will address that in a future lecture. But just very briefly, so a null hypothesis means that you're saying that if you're comparing 2 groups, you're saying there isn't a difference between these 2 groups. You're saying that there is no impact. So in this case, with the food insecurity question, you would, for instance, say food insecurity does not impact academic outcomes of NKU students. Or let's say you were looking at, does food insecurity impact first-generation college students and non-first-generation college students differentially? So you're trying to figure out, is there a difference in how food insecurity impacts first-gen and non-first-gen students? A null hypothesis there would be that you say, there is no difference in